Okay, welcome to the dysfunctional sports team ownership edition of Conduct Detrimental. This is your co-host, Daniel Wallach. Joining me this week will be a breaking news reporter, Jason Morrin. Jason, we're going to cover two stories this week, two big ones involving dysfunctional pro sports franchise. The first story will involve a stunning, weird development in connection with the sale of the Washington Commanders. And then we're going to bring on, for our second story, Greg Wyshynski, ESPN senior reporter, to talk about the fallout of the Arizona Coyotes arena vote, shockingly failing at the polls, soundly rejected by voters in the city of Tempe. But let's start with a new lawsuit filed by Brian Davis's company. And I'll let you fill in the details, but Jason, you were the one that broke the story Friday on Twitter, and it went somewhat viral with Pro Football Talk and Front Office Sports picking it up. Can you tell us what you discovered and a little bit more about the details of this new lawsuit against Bank of America?
Yeah, thank you so much. And like you said, the saga continues. The story has just been unbelievable. The twists and turns that between the Snyders and their malfeasance in running the franchise and the sale that has now taken place and is in the process of completing. This figure, Brian Davis, has really taken a forefront for what reasons that people think are not worthy of time. But meanwhile, we still have to keep talking about him because he is relevant. And yesterday, that is Friday, May 19th, the company that he owns is Urban Echo Energy, filed a lawsuit in the District Court of Maryland against Bank of America, largely alleging that Davis, through his company, had made a bona fide offer to purchase the Washington Commanders from Dan Snyder, and that was in the amount of $7.1 billion is what he's claiming. And that Bank of America didn't properly notify Snyder of the offer. So this is a claim for conversion and replevin. And Davis and his company are seeking injunctive relief, forcing Bank of America to, number one, replenish his account in the amount of $5.1 billion in order for his offer of $7.1 billion for the Commanders to be properly evaluated, in his words. So he's claiming that had Bank of America properly brought this offer to the table to the Snyders, that Dan Snyder would have accepted it. That is his words through his company. So, many people from the beginning didn't take Brian Davis's offer seriously. They said that this seems fishy. The funding didn't seem right. He had lawsuits filed against him in various other capacities relating to financial and liquidation issues. And people said, where is this $7.1 billion coming from? And does he actually have it? And, a lot of people said, this could just be a money grab. And now here we are in a lawsuit and they're speculating maybe that's what this was all along. What do you think?
Or maybe it's money laundering. I mean, sort of the real surprising development in the story as we dig a little bit deeper. The questions have always been raised about the source of Brian Davis's money. I mean, to have $5 billion or to have $7.1 billion sitting around. I mean, at the core of this lawsuit is a request for the return of a bank draft in the amount of $5.1 billion, which would make Brian Davis one of the wealthiest people in the country if this was legitimate. But there were two bank drafts, and they are both attached as exhibits to a sworn statement given by Brian Davis in this lawsuit. One of the exhibits to the complaint is a sworn statement by Mr. Davis, and he attaches copies of the bank draft. There's a check in the amount of, or bank draft in the amount of $5 billion. And then there's a smaller bank draft in the amount of $100 million. Jointly, they add up to $5.1 billion. And Davis is alleging that that money was given by Urban Echo, his corporation, to Bank of America to substantiate the source of the funding. But a closer look at that bank draft reveals something very strange and very unusual, in that the money doesn't come from Mr. Davis's own accounts. It does not come from any corporate assets of Urban Echo. It comes from a third party. And not just any third party, it comes from some dead guy's estate. This is really stunning. The bank drafts are issued from a Citibank account belonging to the estate of Severino Garcia Santa Romana, and it was signed by the administratrix or the administrator of this deceased person's estate. Well, if you go down the rabbit hole on Google and try to research who Severino Garcia Santa Romana is and his relationship with Citibank, it takes you down some dark alleys of the internet, leading you to looted gold, CIA operatives, and former Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos, which obviously is going to raise red flags if you're Bank of America. That, wait a second, is this a legit source of funding? And Davis wants that money replevened or returned to Urban Echo. But if you're Bank of America and you see a bank draft issued from some deceased person's estate, that will undoubtedly raise a duty of inquiry and investigation. So that's where things stand. And you know, a lawsuit filed yesterday has opened up a Pandora's box of questions relating to the legitimacy of the bid and the source of Brian Davis's funding for it.
Yeah, we just have to hope this one makes it to discovery, because I need to see some of the documents and proof that Davis can provide of where this money's coming from. There's been reports that the money has some kind of tracing to Saudi Arabia. I mean, this story is unbelievable. And when Davis was asked that question on 106.7 The Fan, he said, "My money comes from white people who are Jewish, Italian, and Sicilian." That's a real quote. So,
well,
you know,
the issues, if I'm Bank of America, you're always going to look at issues from an anti-money laundering perspective, bank fraud perspective. I mean, if this is coming from Urban Echo's corporate bank account at Citibank, then there's no question as to its its legitimacy, right? It's coming from the corporation that is primarily or solely owned by Brian Davis, but this Italian or the CIA deceased CIA operative, if he is a CIA operative,
right.
it raises the specter of offshore funds, the source of which is of unknown origin. And a little bit of internet research leads you down some dark alleys that suggest looted gold, the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, and I want some discovery on this case. This will clearly either be the uncovering the fraud of the century, or maybe the missing gold has been discovered and the rightful heirs to this looted gold will come into a windfall of $5.1 billion. And it raises more questions about Brian Davis than we had prior to today. But I don't think this is the lawsuit that's going to lead to the National Football League overhauling its criteria for selling NFL franchises. Number one, the case where the claims aren't being asserted against the NFL or Daniel Snyder. It is simply an action to recover funds from a bank.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the fact that it's raising more questions than we had many. That's one wild development. I mean, in March of this year, and this was days after he put in the $7 billion bid to buy the Commanders, him and his company were sued for failing to pay over $300,000 in loans. So, the questions we've had around Brian Davis and legitimacy, we know one thing is that we can't blame Bank of America for whatever due diligence or caution that they have taken and chosen to proceed with in navigating the potential offer and deal. At this point, the Josh Harris group was clearly the more secure, viable, and trustworthy option for Dan Snyder and the NFL to pursue.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question here that this lawsuit has very little chance of derailing Josh Harris's path to ownership. But it's a case we're going to obviously track because it is sensational in some of the discoveries that were made over the last 24 hours. If we had questions as to the source of funding from Brian Davis all along, I think those questions have been magnified by a factor of 1,000 when you take a closer look at his filing.
Yeah, and I'll just pose this question to you because I've seen people discussing this. Some have speculated that this could potentially derail a deal with Josh Harris. You don't think it can. Let me ask you, in what sense would it happen that it could derail? How could that possibly even happen where this lawsuit would derail a deal?
Unless he's asking for preliminary injunctive relief or a court order to stop the NFL sale process. A case like this that proceeds to a judgment won't do so until 2024, 2025, long after the Commanders franchise has been sold. So if Brian Davis or Urban Echo want to get into the queue to override, to override Josh Harris's bid, he's got to make his case to the NFL. He's got to make his case to Dan Snyder. Dan Snyder is obviously aware from reading the news that there's this fellow by the name of Brian Davis who claims to have made a $7.1 billion bid. I'm sure even on his yacht in the Caribbean, Dan Snyder is privy directly or indirectly to that information. So the case is to be made to the league or to Snyder. Failing that, without a court ruling preliminarily, like a TRO, this isn't going to stop anything.
Yeah, I absolutely cannot see that happening.
And the league is under no obligation to accept the highest offer. You look at where the money is sourced. It raises so many questions, and it calls into some significant doubt the legitimacy of Brian Davis as a serious bidder. So notably, his lawsuit is not paired with the request for preliminary injunctive relief or temporary restraining order, and does not name the Commanders, Dan Snyder, or the National Football League as necessary or indispensable parties.
Right. And ultimately, we'll keep track of this lawsuit and follow where it goes. Hopefully, we do get to discovery, because that would just, produce some juicy stuff for us to look into. But really, really interesting. This one caught wind of it yesterday and tweeted it out, and the responses have just been great. Some great buzz around it, and it's really interesting. I'd love to know why Davis, through his company, believes that Snyder would have accepted it. I wonder if there were some kind of communications that make him say that, or is he just conjuring that up out of thin air?
Yeah. I'd also love to know how you found this lawsuit. This was one of the great, sports law investigative finds of the last year, because, if you look for a lawsuit with the NFL or Snyder or the Commanders, easy. You look at the court dockets for the names in the caption, but this is just simply Urban Echo versus Bank of America. This is not going to be on most people's radars. You're not even going to know to look for it. So all the credit to you for being savvy enough to understand that Urban Echo was Brian Davis's company. And a lawsuit like this in the District of Maryland probably would have escaped notice had you not found it. So congratulations, another exclusive from Morrin and Conduct Detrimental. So we turn now to our second story. Maybe even more surprising, a public vote on a privately financed new hockey arena for the Arizona Coyotes failed. There were three propositions, Proposition 301, 302, and 303, that proposed changes to the City of Tempe's land use plans and zoning code to allow for the development of a hockey arena, as well as related entertainment and residential district. And for quite a while, the polling, or at least the conventional wisdom, is that this measure was going to pass overwhelmingly, because the team wasn't looking for public money. They were going to finance the construction of the arena by themselves. Of course, they were going to get tax breaks, and the city was going to pay for some of the remediation costs associated with this site, which was a landfill, a dump. But the voters ended up deciding that they preferred a dump, a landfill, over an NHL franchise. And we're going to bring on today ESPN senior reporter Greg Wyshynski to, one, break down what happened, And two, probably the more important question looking ahead as to what's next. Is there going to be a relocation? What cities are going to be in the running? And, third, are there any backup options for the Arizona Coyotes to remain in the state of Arizona? And what about the potential downstream impacts to players on the roster, such as Clayton Keller, who has already begun to make waves of not wanting to play for the Coyotes next year, as well as some of their draftees, such as Logan Cooley, who has announced that he's going to be returning to the University of Minnesota. This is a collegiate player who averaged 2 points a game at one of the most storied college programs in the NCAA, was clearly going to be a contender for the Calder Trophy had he decided to come out and play his rookie year in the 2023-2024 season. Instead, in the aftermath of this vote going south, Cooley has announced his intention to return to college. Will he end up becoming the next Kevin Hayes, Jimmy Vesey, Adam Fox, and become the most desired collegiate free agent on August 15th, 2026? So we're going to explore all those issues with one of the best hockey writers going, Greg Wyshynski. But I want to ask for your impressions, Jason, as to what you think was what's your takeaway from the adverse vote in the city of Tempe, because it knocked everybody for a loop. Nobody really saw this coming.
Yeah, I was totally stunned, just like everybody else was. I really thought this was a slam dunk from the beginning. I thought the Tempe Wins campaign, was run well from the information that I saw. And everyone was just so excited for hockey in Tempe and for the Coyotes to finally thrive and have a permanent home. And, that's what we're all hoping for. I don't think anybody really wants to see this franchise continuously go through the turmoil that it has, with such passionate fans there. And it just begs me to think about some of the shortcomings that may have happened here. I mean, one of the main problems, speaking of the campaign, is that Tempe Wins and the Coyotes were outspent. How does that happen?
I think the Coyotes outspent the opposition in terms of overall funding. Maybe on the advertising, the opponents brought more assets to the table. I think that might be one of the key issues here. Did the Coyotes believe their own internal polling and take their foot off the gas pedal, a la Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election, when she's going away, clearly in the lead over Donald Trump, and then Trump prevails on election day? Did the Coyotes believe their own press clippings and their own internal polling? And did they not do everything that they could have done in the weeks leading up to election day?
Right. And, I really do think they badly misjudged the voters. It's not so uncommon in terms of the returns by age group. You have about 40% of voters were 55 and up, and voters 18 to 24 years old were only about 3 to 4%. Why weren't the Coyotes in their campaign at Arizona State University registering students to vote? Those are the kind of voters they needed to get out more in order to win this. And they needed to convince these students that, you take a short trip to Tempe and you enjoy a game with a great entertainment district and area. And that was part of the failure and part of Tempe Wins and the Coyotes.
Well, they were co-opted, I think, by the Tempe First group, because there were some Arizona State University students that were quoted as being part of the opposition. So I think the Coyotes ownership was beaten to the punch. But I think this battle was lost in November, roughly a half a year before the special election, because coming from the world of sports betting and the legalization efforts that take place on the state level, you never want to leave it in the hands of the voters. If the state legislature has the authority to pass the measure, it's much easier to convince 7 members of the Tempe City Council, or 4 out of 7 members, to approve a measure than it is to go to the risk and uncertainty of thousands of voters who aren't as easily corralled and influenced as state lawmakers, or at least at the Tempe level, city lawmakers, members of the city commission. And this goes back all the way to January of 2022, when the intention at that time was to present the land use. I think it was a general plan amendment to basically have the property recharacterized from commercial to mixed use, but it was not a major plan amendment. It was characterized as a minor general plan amendment that had sort of a rezoning of commercial to mixed use and higher densities involved. That did not need to be presented to the electorate. And at the time of some of this early reporting by Craig Morgan of Phoenix Sports, supposedly the Coyotes had 3 out of the 7 city council members on their side ready to vote yes. 2 were against, 2 were undecided. And one of the issues that became a contentious deal point was how much of the remediation costs were going to be absorbed by the Coyotes ownership group versus how much would be paid by the city. And I think the estimate was that it would take $70 to $80 million to environmentally clean up this former landfill site. And the Coyotes were willing to put up 40 million of it. And the reporting from Craig Morgan suggests that had the Coyotes been willing to fund the entire remediation cost, this would have been a done deal. Instead, they were penny wise, pound foolish, and later on that year, the city council decided to refer the matter to a public vote when the Coyotes were only 1 vote short and had the wherewithal to convince other members who were on the fence to vote for their side had there been a greater financial package offered by the Coyotes. So this is a bet the company situation. There's no going home. You lose this battle, you lose this initiative. It places the future of the franchise in a matter of serious uncertainty and might lead to the relocation of the team. We're going to talk about that with Greg, but if you're the Coyotes and these are the 2 foreseeable alternatives, you leave no stone unturned, you pony up the money, you avoid the uncertainty of a public vote. So I think this war was lost when the Coyotes did not prevail upon the city council to pass the measure as a legislative matter and instead allow this to go to a public vote. Once that happened, you're dealing with something beyond your control.
I totally agree with you. I think, you never leave it up to chance for something so instrumental in the franchise's history. You can't leave it up to voters who you don't know, and they didn't make a great enough effort to get to know. And back when this first went to referendum, just to take a step back, so the 2 groups we're referencing, the first is Tempe First, which is an opposition group who, heavily promoted voting no to the 3 propositions we've discussed. And the group that the Coyotes had is called Tempe Wins, and they were the ones pushing for the vote to be yes to build the stadium and move the Coyotes to Tempe. Now, what Tempe First did, I think, was very, very smart, and I think it landed with voters. Their slogan was no handouts to billionaires, and I even think they called the Coyotes owner a corrupt billionaire. So their entire campaign strategy was to, kind of paint this project as coming out of the citizens' taxpayer money, and that it was a handout to another billionaire. And it really landed with the voters. And I don't think the Coyotes did enough to kind of dispel some of the falsehoods that were going around about how this was being funded and what it would do to their tax money. I mean, this landfill is still going to have to be cleaned up. And this was a privately funded project in the majority that was not as bad as a tax burden as a future project may be. And as soon as this went to referendum, Tempe First has had a presence. And I think part of the problem was that the Coyotes, led by their CEO, Xavier Gutierrez, he decided to wait until after the Super Bowl to really start pushing and campaigning. And the quote that kept circulating from Gutierrez was that he wanted to wait until after the Super Bowl so that this was top of mind. And I think from that point, he just waited too long. And Tempe First just made such an impact in that amount of time that they were playing catch up and ultimately couldn't.
Yeah, this is not the first time that an NHL arena project has failed at the polls. 10 years ago, I mean, Jason, you went to Hofstra University. There was a New York Islanders proposed new stadium at the Nassau hub that it was called the Lighthouse Project. And the town of Hempstead put this on a referendum for the citizens of Hempstead to vote upon, and it got rejected. And as a result of it getting rejected, the Islanders ended up moving to Brooklyn, and now are in the Belmont area. So past history shows that if you're looking for handouts for a professional sports team, the electorate is not going to take too kindly to that. And all of these deals to provide funding for new stadiums, these were all done at the legislative level. In New York State, Governor Hochul earmarked close to $800 million to the Buffalo Bills. That was part of the New York State budget last year, and that was approved legislatively, never went to a vote. Same thing with the Tennessee Titans, new stadium deal. Invariably, the teams extort concessions from lawmakers and legislators. They never want it to go to a public vote, because guess what? The public is not going to be overly sympathetic to a billionaire owner, particularly in a market such as Arizona that has made the playoffs only 9 times in 26 years, has gone through multiple bad owners, bankruptcies, losing seasons, tanking. The atmosphere was not necessarily the most positive one for a public vote. I mean, if you're winning the Stanley Cup or you're competing for the playoffs year after year after year, I think you build up some reservoir of goodwill. But the Coyotes, who were evicted from the city of Glendale for non-payment of state taxes, local taxes, have a reputation for stiffing their vendors and squeezing concessions out of their vendors. Their on-the-ice product was not an attractive one, and given their history, it was incredibly short-sighted to expect that the public, and in particular, the City of Tempe electorate, would have any sympathy for the Arizona Coyotes proposition. And I think it was naive for the Coyotes to let it go to a public vote instead of working the back room and convincing the city council to vote in favor of it. If you don't like this city council, there are always going to be new elections, and you could throw money at new candidates. That's what the San Francisco 49ers did in Santa Clara. They didn't like their local city council. Well, they just elected new ones that would side with them. And there was a game plan. There was a long view that they could have taken to win this, either through a positive city council vote or just to change the city council until you got 4 of them who liked your project. And instead, they picked the path of the greatest resistance and ended up losing. And the consequence here may be that the 10th largest market in the United States will be without an NHL team, which raises the question, where do you see this? Where do you see this ultimately heading? A relocation, or just a revised deal somewhere else, or even in the same place within Arizona? Do you have any thoughts as to where you see the logical next step?
Yeah, I think the immediate answer in the short term is that we're going to see the Coyotes back at Bullitt Arena next season. I don't envision anything either in the way of relocation or staying in Arizona. The Twitter account is now putting out polls of which city they should play in, which has been unbelievable to follow. I never thought I would see that from a team's Twitter account. Ultimately, I think they're in Bullitt Arena next season with the 5,000 person capacity. And I really, really hope they can make this work in Arizona, whether it's Mesa or otherwise. Yeah. That is really my hope. But there's just no evidence to say why this next city will work versus why the last one didn't. Yeah. So my ultimate prediction is that this is going to end in relocation. I do believe that now.
I think it could still work in Arizona. I think the options on the table are to go back to the City Council of Tempe with either the same proposal, which probably wouldn't make political sense anyway if the voters just rejected it, but narrow the scope and breadth of the existing proposal, maybe eliminate some of the, residential units and have a skinnier project that won't raise issues with the city of Phoenix or the Phoenix airport. Come back with a modified project, have it approved by the city commission, pony up more money as a team, as a franchise, pay for more of the remediation costs, and maybe you get city approval at some point in 2023 or 2024, and you could move forward with maybe a delay of 9 months to a year. Short of that, I think you got to be looking at a tribal reservation, potentially, city of Phoenix, but the sight lines at that arena are not conducive to hockey. Or I think where they should have gone all along was Scottsdale. That's where that's where your customer base is from, and Scottsdale would have been sort of the ideal, I think, market to house an NHL franchise like the Arizona Coyotes. If they look abroad, if they look outside the state, the theme of our podcast is Brass Bonanza, which was the theme song of the Hartford Whalers. I don't think Hartford is going to get another NHL team in our lifetime, but I am partial to the former WHA franchise known as the Quebec Nordiques. I love their uniform. I love, as a fan of 80s NHL hockey, I crave more Nordiques, Montreal Canadiens rivalries. Dallas and Houston, that could be an interesting rivalry, but there's no history there. Montreal and Quebec, that's steeped in ethnic and hockey history, and my personal choice would be the Quebec Nordiques. But we've got so many questions and so many areas to cover with our next guest. I think we covered a lot of the localized issues concerning why the measure failed on the ground in Phoenix. But I want to talk to Greg about what options the National Hockey League has on the table, what are viable Arizona options, what are viable out-of-state relocation options, and how this is going to impact the league, its players, the teams, players, and draftees. And we're going to bring Greg on to discuss all of these issues next.